Good day everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Mark and I'm truly grateful you're here today because we're about to dive into a heartbreaking, eye-opening, and deeply personal story for millions of Filipinos. Imagine leaving behind your home, family, and children to chase a dream in a foreign land. A dream not for yourself but for those you love. This is the reality of thousands of Filipina domestic helpers in Hong Kong. They arrive with hope in their hearts, carrying the weight of their families' futures on their shoulders. But for some, that dream turns into a nightmare. In this video, we're not just talking about numbers, we're talking about real lives. We will uncover the painful history of how Filipinas became the backbone of Hong Kong's domestic workforce and the sacrifices they continue to make every single day. But beyond that, we'll also take a hard look at the tragic and shocking cases where some of these women, desperate, exploited, or caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, have found themselves behind bars. In 2025, between 180,000 and 190,000 Filipino domestic helpers are working in Hong Kong, forming the largest group of foreign domestic workers. Yet hidden beneath these numbers are the stories that rarely make headlines. Over 100 Filipinos currently imprisoned in Hong Kong, making up about 20 to 25% of foreign inmates. Their stories are not just statistics, they are cries for help, cautionary tales, and reminders of the struggles faced by migrant workers. From wrongful accusations to heartbreaking betrayals, from acts of desperation to tragic mistakes, today we'll reveal 15 shocking, heartbreaking, and thought-provoking cases of Filipino domestic helpers who found themselves entangled in the unforgiving world of crime and punishment in Hong Kong. Stay with me because these stories deserve to be heard. Here are 15 notable cases of Filipino domestic helpers involved in crimes in Hong Kong over the years. 1. The murder of an employer's baby, 2010. A moment of frustration, a lifetime of regret. In 2010, a Filipino domestic helper was convicted of killing a 2-year-old baby girl in her care. The helper was reportedly frustrated due to the child's constant crying, which led to the fatal incident. The court found the helper guilty of manslaughter, and she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. This case highlighted the mental and emotional strains some domestic workers face when caring for children. 2. The brutal murder of an employer, 2010, from caregiver to killer. In 2010, a Filipino domestic helper was convicted of murdering her employer after a dispute escalated. The domestic worker, whom the family had employed for several years, was reportedly facing pressure from her employer due to her long hours and personal issues. During a heated argument, the helper attacked her employer, resulting in her death. This tragic case brought attention to the emotional and mental strain some migrant workers endure, and it raised questions about the need for better emotional and psychological support for workers. 3. Drug smuggling and trafficking, 2014. The deadly lure of easy money. In 2014, several Filipino domestic workers were arrested in Hong Kong for involvement in drug trafficking. They were caught smuggling narcotics, including cocaine and heroin, into the city. The authorities claim that international drug syndicates recruited some of these workers to carry drugs in exchange for large sums of money. Several Filipino women were sentenced to lengthy prison terms for their roles in the smuggling network. 4. Theft and fraud, 2014. A web of lies and betrayal. In 2014, a Filipino domestic worker was arrested for stealing from her employer and committing fraud. She had been trusted with her employer's credit cards and used them to make numerous unauthorized transactions. The worker was also found to have used the identity of her employer to make fraudulent purchases online. The case resulted in the helper being sentenced to jail time, and it led to a wider. 5. The case of domestic worker and employer's theft, 2015. A year of trust, a moment of deception. In 2015, a Filipino domestic worker was convicted of theft from her employer's home. She worked for the family for over a year before the theft was discovered. The helper had stolen valuable items, including jewelry and cash, from her employer. She was arrested after the family noticed the missing items, and the case raised concerns about trust between employers and domestic workers. 6. Domestic violence, 2016. When the caregiver becomes the accused. In 2016, a Filipino domestic helper was involved in a case of domestic violence where she was accused of physically assaulting her elderly employer. The helper reportedly worked long hours without adequate rest and was said to have grown frustrated with her employer's demands. The elderly woman filed a complaint, and after an investigation, the domestic worker was charged with assault. This case highlighted the issue of workplace violence, especially within the confines of live-in arrangements, where workers often feel trapped and unable to seek help. 7. The theft of employers' credit cards, 2017. A dangerous game of greed. A Filipino domestic helper was sentenced to jail in 2017 after being found guilty of stealing her employer's credit cards. She used the stolen cards to make numerous purchases at local stores. In Hong Kong, people can swipe their credit cards without double-checking who they are, unlike in the Philippines. The crime came to light when the employer checked their bank statements and found unauthorized charges. This case sparked a discussion about the need for stronger supervision of migrant workers to prevent theft and fraud. 8. Assault on an elderly employer, 2018. When patience runs out. In 2018, a Filipino domestic helper was charged with assault after allegedly attacking her elderly employer. The helper was accused of striking the elderly woman multiple times during an argument. The elderly woman later filed a complaint, and the domestic worker was arrested and convicted of assault. This case raised questions about the challenges domestic workers face when dealing with difficult working conditions, and it led to calls for better protection of workers in Hong Kong. 9. Abuse of employers' children, 2018. A parent's worst nightmare. In 2018, a Filipino domestic helper was arrested after allegations surfaced that she had been abusing her employer's children. The children reportedly complained to their parents about being mistreated, and after further investigation, the helper was found to have verbally and physically abused the children. The case sparked public outrage and raised concerns about the potential for domestic workers to be in positions where they could exert power and control over vulnerable children. It also reignited discussions about background checks and training for domestic workers to prevent such abuse. 10. Drug possession and personal use, 2019. A dangerous escape from reality. In 2019, a Filipino domestic helper was arrested for possessing illegal drugs, specifically methamphetamine, for personal use. The worker was caught during a routine check by the police, and upon investigation, the drugs were found in her personal belongings. The worker admitted to using drugs as a way to cope with the stress of living away from her family. She was sentenced to a prison term, and the case raised concerns about the mental health and well-being of domestic workers in Hong Kong. 11. Assault on a fellow worker, 2020. When tensions boil over, a Filipino domestic helper was arrested for assaulting a fellow worker in 2020. The two domestic helpers, both Filipino, had a dispute that escalated into physical violence. The assault was reported to the police, and the attacker was arrested for assault. The case highlighted the sometimes volatile conditions in shared living spaces, mainly when multiple domestic workers are employed in the same household. 12. Involvement in illegal migrant networks. 2020. A ruthless betrayal. In 2020, a Filipino domestic worker was arrested for her involvement in an illegal migrant worker network that trafficked individuals from the Philippines to Hong Kong and other countries under false pretenses. The helper had been working as a recruiter for the network, convincing other domestic workers to pay large sums of money for supposed job placements in Hong Kong. The operation was discovered when a group of victims reported the fraudulent activities. The Filipino worker was arrested for her role in human trafficking and sent to prison. This case highlighted the vulnerability of migrant workers, who are often preyed upon by unscrupulous recruiters and agents. 13. Embezzlement from employer, 2021, a shocking breach of trust. In 2021, a Filipino domestic helper was arrested for embezzling a significant sum of money from her employer. The helper had been working with the family for several years and was trusted with the family's finances. Over time, she systematically transferred funds from her employer's accounts to her own. The theft was uncovered when the employer noticed discrepancies in their accounts. The helper was charged with embezzlement and sentenced to prison. 14. Sexual assault on an employer's child, 2022. A crime that stunned the community. In a highly sensitive case, a Filipino domestic helper was arrested in 2022 for allegedly sexually assaulting her employer's young child. The crime was uncovered after the child reported the abuse, leading to a police investigation. The Filipino helper was arrested and charged with sexual assault. The case shocked the community and led to public discussions about the vulnerability of children in households with domestic workers and the need for thorough background checks. 15. Illegal gambling and loan sharking, 2023. A desperate gamble. In 2023, a Filipino domestic worker was involved in illegal gambling and loan sharking activities. She was part of a group that ran an underground gambling ring and was later implicated in loan sharking, where she reportedly provided high-interest loans to fellow domestic workers. The authorities uncovered the network after a raid, and several individuals, including a Filipino domestic worker, were arrested and charged with running an illegal gambling operation. The case raised concerns about domestic workers' financial pressures and the risks they might take to make ends meet. While these cases are shocking and tragic, they do not define the hard-working and law-abiding Filipina domestic helpers who contribute significantly to Hong Kong. However, they serve as a stark reminder of the struggles these workers face: exploitation, financial desperation, emotional turmoil, and isolation. Behind each crime is a deeper story, a story of a woman who once had dreams, a story of pressure, survival, and sometimes a tragic fall from grace. What do you think needs to change to prevent cases like these from happening? Let me know in the comments below. The Untold Story, the Filipino domestic helpers of Hong Kong, the dream of a better life, how it all started. Under the late Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos's rule in the 1970s, the Philippines struggled with a stagnating economy, political instability, and widespread poverty. For many families, the dream of a better life seemed like a distant horizon. Young women in particular were looking for opportunities outside the traditional roles that society had assigned them. Many saw migration as a way to escape poverty and create better futures for their families. Meanwhile, across the sea, Hong Kong was on the rise. The city rapidly evolved from a humble manufacturing hub into a booming financial center, attracting multinational companies and foreign investments. There was a growing demand for labor, particularly in domestic services. With the local population increasingly absorbed in the workforce, the need for full-time live-in domestic helpers became pressing. The Hong Kong government, recognizing the gap, began opening work visas for foreign workers, migrant women from countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, eager to work abroad. Filipino women were seen as a perfect fit. Their hardworking, respectful, and family-oriented reputation made them highly sought after. A new beginning in a foreign land. The first Filipino domestic helpers arrived in Hong Kong in the 1970s, entering homes as caregivers, housekeepers, and companions. For many, this was the beginning of an arduous yet transformative journey. They performed various tasks, cleaning homes, caring for children, preparing meals, and assisting the elderly. But this work, while essential, was often overlooked and undervalued by society. In many ways, these women became the backbone of Hong Kong's burgeoning economy. As local women began to join the workforce in more significant numbers, the role of domestic helpers grew even more crucial. They weren't just workers, they were the quiet hands that allowed other women to follow their ambitions, freeing them from the often overwhelming tasks of household chores. The live-in rule, a double-edged sword. By the early 2000s, the Hong Kong government, in its quest to maintain order and control over the growing migrant domestic workforce, implemented a live-in rule. The idea was to ensure that these workers would reside within the employer's home to provide continuous, around-the-clock care for those who needed it most: children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. This policy, though, came with its own set of challenges. On the one hand, it served the government's policy goal of providing a stable, dependable workforce for families with demanding care needs. On the other hand, it stripped away the workers' privacy and autonomy. It institutionalized their role as employees and permanent fixtures in their employers' homes. In theory, the rule required employers to offer suitable accommodation with some degree of privacy. But in reality, the interpretation of suitable was left vague, and too often the accommodation was far from ideal. Some helpers slept on bathroom floors, others in cramped makeshift spaces. There were no clear guidelines about how much space a helper should have, or how the accommodations should be structured. As a result, many helpers endured poor living conditions, despite the law's intent to protect them. In many cases, the punishment for breaking this rule was severe. Domestic helpers living outside their employer's home could face a ban from working in Hong Kong, and their employers could be fined or even imprisoned for providing false information. The stakes were high, and for many workers, the risk of losing their livelihood was a constant fear. The struggle for dignity and rights. For decades, Filipino domestic helpers endured these harsh realities, all the while sending home remittances to support their families. The money they earned was a lifeline, not just for themselves but for entire communities. Through their sacrifices, they provided for children's education, built houses, and gave their families the hope of a better future. But the workers' struggles didn't go unnoticed. Over time, organizations within Hong Kong and the Philippines began to rise in defense of these women. The Hong Kong Federation of Women's Centers, the Mission for Migrant Workers, and other advocacy groups began pushing for legal reforms to improve the lives of domestic helpers. They called for better housing conditions, fairer wages, and more transparency in the recruitment process. While improvements have been made over the years, such as the introduction of minimum wage laws and tightening regulations on working hours, the battle is far from over. The legacy of these migrant women is still one of resilience in the face of adversity. They have become not only the workers who care for others, but also symbols of strength, perseverance, and hope. A story of solidarity and strength. Beyond the legal struggles and the difficult living conditions, there is a story of community. Filipino workers in Hong Kong come together every Sunday to gather in the city's parks and streets. In these public spaces, they find moments of respite where they can share their stories, sing songs, worship, and support each other in a foreign land. These gatherings symbolize the Filipino community's unbreakable bond, spirit of solidarity, and unwavering determination. They are more than just workers. They are daughters, mothers, sisters, and wives. They are heroes in their own right, heroes who leave behind their families to care for others, working long hours and sacrificing their comforts for a better future. A legacy of wisdom and lessons. The story of Filipino domestic helpers in Hong Kong is a story of sacrifice, struggle, and triumph. It teaches us about the hidden cost of labor, the resilience of the human spirit, and the power of solidarity. These women who left their homes to care for others have left an indelible mark on the fabric of Hong Kong society. They have shown the world the value of work that often goes unrecognized. For the families they help, they are not just workers. They are the silent architects of dreams, the invisible threads that hold everything together. As the years go by, their legacy will continue to inspire those who come after them, teaching us all that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for hope and the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. In the end, the Filipino domestic helpers of Hong Kong are more than just part of the labor force. They are part of a shared human story of struggle, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of a better life. They remind us that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday acts of love and service that often go unnoticed. And in that, there is wisdom. The untold stories of Filipino domestic helpers in Hong Kong, a story of sacrifice, struggle, and strength. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching this video and for listening to the unheard stories. If this video moved you, taught you something new, or opened your eyes to the realities they face, please consider showing your support. A simple like, share, or comment can help raise awareness of their struggles. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. It encourages us to continue sharing these important stories. Again, this is Mark. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay informed and compassionate. I'll see you in the next video.